And a very good morning and welcome to the second HBF live event, our second webinar. And it's great to see so many of you here. Around 500 of you have registered to take part and sign up to listen to today, watch today's event. So we hope you have a very interesting and informative time over the next 90 minutes or so. Of course, our webinar comes in a very timely fashion, not 24 hours after the speech by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, his summer statement to the House of Commons yesterday afternoon. And of course, that's one of the things that we'll be touching on in detail as we go through today, particularly with our first two speakers. So let's have a look very quickly at the day's agenda so you can see what's going to happen over the next 90 minutes or so. And first of all, as you can see, we've got two very experienced commentators on market affairs and two people who are very plugged in to what's happening and indeed will have very good views and insights into what's coming next. Grania Gilmore, who's a regular at HBF conferences, used to be of the Knight Frank parish, but now is head of research at Zoopla. And I think making his first appearance, but very welcome appearance, David Livesey, who's the group chief group chief executive at Connells, of course, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, estate agency chains in the country. And David's insight into what's happening across the whole market, I'm sure, will be fascinating for many of you. After we've covered the first session, which, as I say, is going to focus on those areas of the market and where the market's going, we're going to talk about planning. This was a subject that came up on probably more questions than almost anything else on our first webinar. And so a week or so ago, Andrew Whitaker, the HBF's planning director, sat down with Michael Bingham, who's the acting chief planner at MHCLG, for a fascinating chat. And that'll be coming up in our second session. And then after that, members of the HBF team will be on hand, led by our managing director, Neil Jefferson. David O'Leary will be here, and amongst other things, he'll be able to bring you up to date with Help to Buy. And Kieran Walker, our technical director, will also be here, and he will give you the latest news. Not, I'm afraid, that there is a huge amount of news on what's happening with the building regulation changes on Part L and Part F and building safety and so on. So that's the agenda for the next 90 minutes or so. But before we go to our first speakers, let's just pick up on a few of the key issues that were raised by the Chancellor in his statement yesterday. A statement which he labelled as being focused very much on jobs, on supporting jobs, on creating jobs, on protecting jobs. But probably the biggest announcement for the housing sector, not just the house building sector, but the second-hand housing market as well, was confirmation of stories that have been running in the press for several days of a change to stamp duty, and in particular, of course, the change to the threshold at which stamp duty becomes payable, which has now been increased from £125,000 to £500,000 with immediate effect until the 31st of March next year. And both of our speakers will be talking about that in just a moment. In addition, though, unfortunately, there was nothing specific on Help to Buy in the statement yesterday, and we'll touch on Help to Buy later, as I've said, when David O'Leary joined us. But the Chancellor's statement did pick up on job retention bonuses, on kickstart schemes, and on VAT cuts. And a lot of this was obviously aimed at the hospitality sector in particular, including, of course, the opportunity to go out and eat for half price on Mondays to Wednesdays during August, which I'm sure a lot of you will avail yourselves of, as you probably can't get overseas this summer as it currently stands, or at least not as easily as you could in the past. I just wanted to touch on a couple of key issues before we move on, issues that have been dominating the work at HBF over the last month or so since we held our first one of these live events. The return to work has gone extremely well. I think you probably all know that, those of you that are working directly in the house building community. Production efficiency seems to have returned to somewhere between 80 and 100%, depending on the type of site and exactly what sort of production levels are possible. The sales market has rebounded in a much more positive way, frankly, than almost any of us thought was likely, and appears to have continued that strength during the second month since we were given permission by the government to reopen for sales on the 13th of May, almost 2 months ago. We've had no real instances at HBF of any issues, whether they be health and safety issues or media issues or issues with members of the public concerned about the work on housing sites. So I think it's a huge congratulations to the entire house building community for the way that they've been able to design and implement some pretty strong protocols to ensure the safety, of course, of our own workers, the safety of our customers, and ensuring that Public Health England guidelines and the rules on social distancing are adhered to. The second area I just wanted to touch on was something you may not know too much about, but which you are likely to hear an increasing amount from us about in the months and years ahead, and that is what's known as the CLC Housing Working Group. Now, that CLC is the Construction Leadership Council. It's something we're a part of. It encompasses all areas of construction, but it's recently reinvented itself, partly as a consequence of the special situation we found ourselves in, and rather than meeting 2 or 3 times a year, it's been meeting on a daily basis, now meeting 2 or 3 times a week. And we have been asked to lead the housing working group of the CLC. And that is a pretty wide-ranging group. It's a standing group. It's going to be around for a little while, so it's not time-limited in the sense of coming forward with proposals for either the next budget or the next major event. But it is focusing on, and we are able to drive this agenda, which is the advantage for us. It gives us another channel into government, and it is focusing on areas like SME finance, like affordable housing, like the planning system, which of course are key areas of HBF's lobbying work in normal times. And the final thing I just wanted to touch on is the environment agenda, which is very much back with the government. And you would have noticed the Chancellor and others talking about green jobs and the green recovery, and that is clearly going to be a central theme of what emerges from government thinking over the next several months as the recovery takes shape and further measures might be considered necessary. It matters to us because the environment agenda is clearly important. We have the COP26 summit taking place not now in November of this year, but in November of next year. And last week I attended a pre-COP26 discussion with about 150 of the top CEOs and chairmen right across the country from all sorts of businesses, focusing on the areas where business will be involved in the lead up to COP26, most of which you'll be not surprised to hear centers around the commitments which specific industries, businesses or sectors are prepared to make as to what their part is going to be in driving the government's net zero agenda. And let's not forget that the government has put in law, enshrined in law, the requirement for the economy and the country to go to net zero by 2050. And whilst that may sound a long way off, it really isn't. But in the more immediate future, we have the Future Homes Standard set to come in 2025, which is going to have some far-reaching implications for how we operate as home builders and what we're allowed to do on site. And that's something that you may well have questions about, and something I know Kieran Walker will be very pleased to talk about later in the show. So those are just my introductory remarks, and I hope that kind of sets the scene for you. And without further ado, we'll move into our first speaker. Before I do, just to say, if you want to ask questions, please do. It's very easy. If you look on the screen in front of you and look below where I'm probably appearing at the moment, you'll see a question box. You can type your question in there, and we'll do our best to answer them all as we go through the next 90 minutes. And also, we're going to be running some opinion polls. Those of you who were with us at the last event will be familiar with this. Again, very easy. We'll ask some relatively simple questions about some of the big topics that we think are important based on what you've told us about the things that matter to you. And we'd like your opinion on those questions as we go through, and we'll obviously feedback the results to you later in the program. So that's it from now from me. And I'd like to introduce our first guest, who is well known to many of you, a regular face at HBF conferences over the years. And I'm delighted to welcome her this morning, Grania Gilmore, who is now Head of Research at Zoopla. Grania.